All right, today I'm going to be taking you through ATP and cellular respiration. First thing we're going to talk about is ATP and the ATP-ADP cycle. So for cells to be able to do any kind of work, they need energy. Types of things that they would need energy to do are making new molecules, like they need to make proteins or carbohydrates or lipids. Building membranes and organelles, so making actual cell structures. Moving molecules in and out of the cell can require energy, as well as movement of the cell itself. So these are all different kinds of things that cells might need energy for in order for them to be able to do just basic functions. So how does a cell get energy? So the main way that we think about cells getting energy is from carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates will get broken down through a process called cellular respiration. The end result of cellular respiration is that energy gets stored in a molecule called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And it's a special molecule that is designed to temporarily store energy for us, and that is really easy for our cells to get energy from it. Through cellular respiration, we're going to break down big carbohydrates and get the energy from the bonds that are holding the molecules together, and we're going to put that energy into an easier form called ATP. The way the cell will use this is when you have a molecule of ATP, it has 3 phosphates on the end of it. So that's what the triphosphate part is. And if the cell needs energy, it will simply remove one of those phosphates from the ATP. We get a release of energy, and we get a new molecule called ADP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. It only has 2 phosphate groups on it, so it has less energy. When the cell is doing cellular respiration, it has extra energy that it wants to store. That energy is going to get stored by adding the phosphate back onto ADP, and we will store energy within that phosphate, and we will make ATP again. So that's the basic way that cells get energy. It's pretty simple. What we're going to do now is talk about how we actually make that ATP for our cells. So the process by which we're going to do that is called cellular respiration. So in this process, we're going to break down glucose, and we're going to store the energy that was in that glucose in the molecules of ATP. This process happens both in the cytoplasm of the cell and in mitochondria. So cytoplasm is the kind of liquidy outside of the cell, and the mitochondrion is one of the cell parts inside of the cell. The more energy that a cell needs, like something like a muscle cell or a nerve cell, the more mitochondria that cell is going to have. Okay. And this is an aerobic process because it requires oxygen. So anytime we talk about something being aerobic, that means it requires oxygen. If we say something is anaerobic, it means it does not require oxygen. And we'll take a look at one of those reactions later. All right, so cellular respiration, the formula for cellular respiration looks like this. Okay, so we have oxygen and glucose are the reactants that we need, and they're going to form carbon dioxide and water. And from that, we're going to get energy up to 38 ATP can get made from this process. This reaction, this formula, when you look at it, is actually looks like the reverse of photosynthesis. And so we'll take a closer look at that later. So we're going to break down the reactants and products and look at where they're being used and produced during this process. So the reactions of cellular respiration come in 3 steps. The first step is called glycolysis. In glycolysis, glucose is going to get split in half. And this happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, so it's outside of the mitochondria. And from that process, we're going to make 2 ATP. Next, the products of that splitting of glucose are going to move into the mitochondrion, and they're going to undergo a process called the Krebs cycle, where those products are going to get broken down into carbon dioxide. That's going to release energy from the bonds. That energy can be used in the next step. And we also end up making 2 ATP from this. And then the final step of this is something called the electron transport chain. And this is where we're going to take that energy from the Krebs cycle and we're going to use it to produce 34 ATP. In order for this process to work, we have to use oxygen and we end up making water as we use that oxygen. So at the end of this entire process, we get a total of up to 38 ATP being made. Okay. All right. So this just shows you a diagram. So this is the mitochondrion in the middle, and the area outside would be the cytoplasm. Okay. And so we start with glycolysis. So glucose is going to enter into glycolysis, and the products of that are called pyruvic acid. They are what are going to enter into the Krebs cycle. And from that, they are going to make carbon dioxide as a waste. Okay. And then the energy that was extracted from the Krebs cycle, some of it goes into ATP, most of it goes over to the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, oxygen is going to get converted to water. And during that process, we end up making a whole bunch more ATP, and that can be up to 34. And so that's how we get our total of 38. All right, now sometimes there's not oxygen available for a cell. So they might be that there's in a low oxygen environment, sometimes in our own bodies, if you're exercising a lot, you might not get a lot of oxygen going to your muscles. And so our cells have a different way of getting energy when that is the case. This is called fermentation. So when we are in an anaerobic situation, we don't have a lot of oxygen available, we will do fermentation, which will happen in the cytoplasm. From doing fermentation, the cell will gain only 2 ATP, which actually comes from glycolysis. So it's not nearly as energy efficient as doing cellular respiration with that oxygen, because remember, you can get 38 ATP from that. Here we only get 2, but sometimes that's all we have. There are 2 types of fermentation that can happen. The first is called alcohol. Alcohol fermentation happens in yeast, and it will make alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. So these are used in the brewing of things like beer. We also use yeast when making bread rise because of the carbon dioxide that's made. The other type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation, and this is what happens in our muscle cells. So if you've ever experienced sore muscles after working out, it's because of a buildup of lactic acid, because your cells had to revert to doing fermentation to get enough energy to keep those muscles contracting. All right, so to summarize this, and we're going to take a look at just the connection between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So the products of photosynthesis, which are glucose and oxygen, are the reactants of cellular respiration. So that means that the things that are made by photosynthesis are going to be used in cellular respiration. And then the reverse is true of cellular respiration. The products of cellular respiration, which are carbon dioxide and water, are going to be used in photosynthesis. So if you kind of look at this in a cycle, right, photosynthesis is making that glucose and oxygen, which cellular respiration will use and extract energy from. But then photosynthesis is going to use that carbon dioxide and water from the cellular respiration to make the glucose and oxygen. And this occurs in a cycle, and it's a cycle that's very important to living things.